If anyone cannot hear me, can you raise your hand? Right. Mr. Chairman, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, once upon a time, special days in the calendar were printed in red letter. Tonight I will briefly recall some red letter years, some special years. 358 years ago, the Town Council of Edinburgh established the office of Ordiner Printer to the Good Tune and set up a press in its college library. The university's first book reads, "Printed at Edinburgh in King James's College, 1638. 190 years ago, in 1805, William Wordsworth wrote to Scott, with a confidence few today would dare, a correct text is the first object of an editor. 12 years ago, the university reached the ripe age of 400, and one of the ways it marked that event was by freeing its Ordiner printer, by then called the University Press, from costs of procurement and editing. The cut in overhead allowed us to take a longer look at our aims, and we offered to manufacture, publish, and sell a reliable text of Scott, provided the cost of it could be otherwise found. 10 years ago, Bank of Scotland generously offered to partner the university in funding, and this year its tercentenary will see the publication of the Antiquary, St. Renan's Well, and Redgauntlet, in addition to new banknotes bearing Scott's portrait. Thanks to these bodies, and above all to the energy and scholarship of David Hewitt with his colleagues worldwide, Scott will at last have a text worthy of him. But this is also a special year for our club. 1994, our centenary, was a time to look back and reflect. Today is a time to look ahead and affirm, perhaps even, given some of the recent books about Scott, to assert. And so, in addition to the great honor of being your president, I have the additional privilege of kicking off into our second century. An art critic once distinguished between a living painter and a dead one. When he is alive, he said, all his works are seen as work in progress. After his death, they gather together to form his destination. Malcolm Bradbury said something the same of the author. A signed death certificate is required to turn writing into literature. Literature, whatever else it may be, is in print. Publishing, whatever else it may be, is about deciding what to print. James Hogg once rebuked Scott's publisher Archie Turnbull for presuming to speak about the merit of a work. "That may well be, Hogg," he growled, "that may well be, but I know how to buy a book as well as any man, and I ken how to sell one." Scott is dead. His work has become literature. He no longer needs a publisher to buy and sell. But Milton said that books are not absolutely dead things, but do contain life in them, to be as active as the soul whose progeny they are. As a leopard cannot change his spots, so a publisher, even when reissuing a classic, will keep his antennae tuned for potency and will treat the work before him as if it were unpublished. So tonight I offer a recall of some of what I might call my table talk with Scott, notes scribbled in pencil, I may say, in the margins of his books as I read them, asking myself always, in the vulgar parlance of trade, can this guy write? My point of reference is what an Englishman's Englishman once said. Winter is the one time I can indulge in reading what I like instead of what I ought to read. Slow books come back. While the storm shakes the shutters, I reread Scott, and as the great rumbling periods as surely and steadily as a stagecoach carry me back to Edinburgh, the most beautiful city in these islands, I feel an embarras de richesse. John Betjeman, no less, compliments Scott's genius, Edinburgh's grandeur, and his own judgment. To cavil is churlish, so be it. For one writer to say that another writer is slow, sure, and steady is like patting a Rottweiler on the head and saying, "Good doggy." Scott, when alive, was well able to look after that sort of thing, as when once provoked beyond forbearance by some niggle of James Ballantyne, scrawled on the page proofs of Red Gauntlet, "Horse and noodles." Betjeman, it seems to me, missed such shaping fantasies in Scott as are uncommon in English prose fiction. You remember Midsummer Night's Dream. Lovers and madmen have such seething brains, such shaping fantasies that apprehend more than cool reason ever comprehends. Scott is strong in reason, but like Hermia in The Dream, whose ear more quick of apprehension makes, he could sense a shaping fantasy when no bigger than a man's hand. If Scott had written that sentence, it would be a better one, but let's suppose he had. If one misses the allusion to Elijah, it won't make any difference whatever to the sense. But if you know that when the cloud no bigger than a man's hand burst over Carmel, and Elijah then, in a spirit of sheer daft devilment, outran King Ahab's chariot 16 miles in the downpour to the gates of Jezreel, to know that that was somewhere in the back of Scott's mind would deepen our comprehension of his meaning. Tony Ingalls, in his excellent new edition of Old Mortality for Penguin Books, says that Scott constantly knitted such rich borrowings into the texture of his pages with hazardous brilliance. I like that phrase, hazardous brilliance, and I suggest that it's not very common in English prose fiction as distinct from English poetry or English drama. I bow to none in my respect for English. Unlike the Romance languages, it broke free from the cocoon of Latin and soared in its strength until it was the birthright of every Englishman to write well. Long ago, Sir Philip Sidney put it in words I would nail to the desk of every Secretary of State for Education. Another will say, it wanteth grammar. Nay, truly, it wanteth not grammar. For grammar it might have, but it needs it not, being so easy in itself, and so void of those cumbersome differences of genders, cases, moods, and tenses that I think was a piece of the Tower of Babel's curse that a man should be put to school to learn his mother tongue, but for the uttering sweetly and properly the conceits of the mind, which is the end of speech, that hath it equally with any other tongue in the world, far beyond the Latin. Amen to that. But it was not Scott's birthright. He never wrote an Englishman's English. For his meaning was coloured, as he put it, by all those peculiarities which distinguish us as Scotsmen. The conceits of his mind were formed in a consciousness not English, but cosmopolitan. Betjeman chose an ill figure of speech when he likened reading Scott to the sure and steady progress of a coach. For Scott's coaches are neither sure nor steady, less vehicles of transport than of fancy. Before a road was made, he used to drive over hill tracks to St. Mary's Loch. Upon my soul, he later wrote, looking where we must have gone, To put one's neck to such a venture was too silly. The heart of Midlothian begins with a coach cowped on its back near Gander Clough, its wheels spinning in the air while the driver tries to free the insides, as Scott writes, by a sort of Caesarean process of delivery from the womb of the leathern conveniency. Less carriage than miscarriage. The Tapsotiri coach is the teeming womb of Scott's own mind, from which his characters scramble newborn onto the page into a world of make-believe. If birth, death also. In Rob Roy, Rashleigh Osbaldistone is fatally wounded in the ambush of a carriage, and the bottom of the coach was filled with his blood. In the Wappenshaw, in Old Mortality, the Duke of Hamilton's coach is menaced by Goose Gibbie, charging with levelled pike as if to skewer its occupants like frogs. In a novel set in Hamilton country, the exit of his coach is the last we hear of the Duke, whose liveried flunkies show his total irrelevance to the new world of Morton and Claverhouse. The Antiquary begins with the horse fly starting late, unsure, and breaking down, unsteady. And near the end, the Royal Charlotte is cowpit, as Edie says, at Kittlebrig, whummelled as I whummel a tomb bicker. Tomb bickers, empty flagons, contain nothing but dregs, and that coach contained the villain Dousterswivel. Incidentally, Edie's words, whummelled as I whummel a tomb bicker, come from Ferguson's Rising of the Session, where first all his china pigs are tomb, and then ye change house keepers never grumble when you a while your bickers whumble. There could be an interesting essay on why Scott came up out of his subconscious with that memory. The metaphors, womb, death cell, skewered frogs, tomb bickers, are as bleak as any in the Old Testament and catch Scott's wry acceptance of fortune. Metaphor, Northrop Frye wrote, is not an incidental aspect of biblical landscape, but one of its compelling modes of thought. So it is with Scott. Here from Rob Roy is a description of a waterfall cascading downhill into Loch Ard, where Frank Osbaldistone and Nicol Jarvie are having an alfresco breakfast with Rob and Helen McGregor. The brook, hurling its waters downwards, encountered a barrier rock. The broken waters were received in a beautiful stone basin, and after wheeling around its flinty margin, they made a second precipitous dash through a dark chasm, and thence, in a hurried but more gentle course, escaped to the lake. That, believe it or not, is an extended metaphor for the perils and joys of life with the McGregors. You think I'm making it up? Scott very often puts clues in the ends of his sentences, and that last sentence ends when the waters escaped to the lake. After a rare old time at Aberfoyle, complete with barrier rocks, flinty margins, and precipitous dashes, Frank and Nicol are at that very moment escaping to Loch Lomond and therefore onwards to Glasgow. I catch myself up for a moment here. Betjeman, however, was thinking less of coaches than of Scott's sentences rumbling like carriage wheels. C.S. Lewis, on the other hand, heard not the rumble of wheels, but the clip-clop of the horses, the cheerful rattle of Scott's polysyllables, and the brisk, virile pace. To one, the pace is slow, sure, and steady. To another, brisk and virile. Both have a case to argue. And thanks to the survival of many of Scott's manuscripts, we can actually see the process as it happens. I want to read you a short passage from A History of the Rebellion of 1745, written anonymously in 1747 and unpublished until 1944 when the Roxburgh Club printed it. The passage was pointed out to me by a member of this club, John S. Gibson. Donald Maclaren, drover, discovered a very ready invention. This man with 9 more was carried from Edinburgh September the 5th towards Carlisle in order to be tried. At the top of Etterick Hill, he gave one of the soldiers a charge of his horse on pretence of retiring to relieve nature, and swaddling himself in his plaid, he rolled down the steep hill so quick that though they pursued close and fired at him, yet he made his escape. Scott, wherever he got it from, puts that story into the mouth of Maxwell of Summertrees, a.k.a. Pate in Peril, in Red Gauntlet. I shall read part of it from Scott's own and hardly punctuated manuscript and leave you to judge whether the pace is slow and steady or virile and brisk. Bad as the place was, sir, it was my only chance. And though my very flesh creeped when I thought what a rumble I was going to get, yet I kept my heart up all the same. And so just when we came to the edge of this beef stand of the Johnsons, I slipped my hand from the handcuff, cried to Harry Gauntlet, follow me, whisked under the belly of the dragoon horse, flung my plaid round me with the speed of lightning, threw myself upon my side, for there was no keeping my feet, and down the brae hurled I over heather and fern and blackberries like a barrel down a close in Old Reekie. God, sir, I can never help laughing when I think how the scoundrel redcoats must have been bum-bazed, for the mist being, as I said, thick, they had little notion, I take it, that they were on the verge of such a dilemma. I was halfway down, for Rowan is faster worked than Rinnan, ere they could get at their arms, and then it was flash, 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 rap, rap, rap on the edge of the road. But my head was too jumbled to think of anything either of that or the hard knocks I got among the stones. I kept my senses together, whilk has been thocht wonderful by all that ever saw the place, and to the bottom I came. You've seen many a waterfall, like Frank and Nichol saw, crashing downhill, breaking its descent before plunging on. Scott's torrent of words carries Pate before it like a lumhat wanting a croon. The torrential pace uses what filmmakers call real time, where the time of the action and the time of the telling are one. Had Scott lived in the 20th century, I'm sure he would have been into films, probably with Hitchcock, because Hitchcock once said that the audience's apprehensions are the most important thing you're dealing with. But also, what is said in that passage and how it is said are also one. And T.S. Eliot called such writing the complete consort dancing together. Pate's Tale is a fiddle tune by Neil Gow. Ballantyne's printers tried to play it as a slow march. In the Magnum edition, which is what you all know, of the whole passage, I've only read half the passage, there are about 100 changes, mostly additions. Commas, semicolons, colons, full stops, dashes, changes in spelling. It reminds me of McCaig's poem, To a Blue Stocking. Even her tears, I think savagely, will drop from each eye in pairs, quoting her nose. But Scott no doubt gives us a naked truth, but to be fair, it is usual to dress on going into company, and print keeps company with all the world. So the compositors, setting the type line by line, punctuated it as they went, but without having a clue what was to come. To punctuate subunits without first knowing the shape of the whole is like looking at a pointilliste painting by Sir Signac 6 inches from the canvas and seeing only coloured dots. When I ticked Scott off for this carelessness about his proofreading, he said to me, "Fiddlesticks, treat punctuation like milk or sugar in your tea, take it or leave it." Scott's writing is best when he is at his most rash. In order to create the mood which somehow transferred kinetic energy to his pen, he used to procrastinate and put things off until, as he wrote in the journal, he could hear the press thumping, clattering, and banging in his rear. Take Old Mortality. Scott started writing it in the first week of September 1816, and it was published in the first week of December that same year. Written, copied, typeset, proofread, corrected, proofed, corrected, printed, folded and gathered, bound, shipped to London, and published in 90 days. The writing took 2 months, and the story lasts 2 months. So once again, the tale and its telling are conjunct. This must seem, and has seemed to so many critics, Symes and Scott's part of sheer slapdash approach. But Douglas Mack, who edited it for us, convinced me over many a pleasant pub lunch in Bridge of Ellen that before Scott ever put pen to paper, he had the whole shape of the novel clear in his head. The 3-volume format was habitual to the time, and Scott shaped the form shaped the content to the 3-volume form. In his own manuscript, each volume begins with a military encounter, the contest for the popinjay in Volume 1, the Covenanters' victory at Drumclog in Volume 2, Claverhouse's victory at Bothwell Bridge in Volume 3. But every flow has an ebb, and each volume in the manuscript ends with a meeting face-to-face between the protagonist and antagonist, Morton and Claverhouse, meetings which reflect on what has been and cast their shadows before. So Claverhouse won the war, but Morton the peace. To make this clear, Scott brought Morton back home from exile after Claverhouse's death at Killiecrankie to find a Scotland at peace with itself. As fiction, it is poor stuff. Stendhal used very rude words indeed about it, but it nevertheless, as Douglas wrote in our introduction, it shows that the novel's subject is the emergence of a free, modern, and constitutional state. That requires forethought, not slapdashery. Ever since the Magnum, alas, Scott's chapters have been numbered consecutively throughout, without the volume breaks, thus losing the shape. It's like playing a piano sonata with no pause between movements. Enough of exciting, what then of demanding? Shelley wrote of the electric life which burns within words. Part of that life is sound. And Scott heard the shape of sound and sense together almost as the words started to form in his mind. The passage about Goose Gibbie will illustrate this, for it reminded Scott of the celebrated thrust of Orlando, which broached as many moors as a Frenchman spits frogs. In the Italian, which Scott knew very well indeed, Orlando levels his lance, his asta, and spears his enemies as if they were pasta, until the lance cries, "Enough, basta." Asta, pasta, basta are Ariosto's rhymes and show him fooling to the top of his bent, and then follows a comic simile about spiking frogs. So Scott, of course, wholeheartedly joins in the fun. For though the frogs are Ariosto, the Frenchman is his. What happened is that he translated the Italian rane into the word frogs and instantly leapt backwards, mentally backwards, from frogs to froggies. Frenchmen are froggies, Frenchmen eat frogs. And so Orlando's lance becomes Scott's spit. Although what he wrote quickly with his hand is Frenchman spits frogs, the sequence of creation is, in fact, frogs, Frenchman spits. This shows the effect of sense and the speed at which he wrote and created these things. Let me give you another instance. In St. Ronan's Well, Lady Penfeather says to John Mowbray that she will beware him in future unless he brings his sister with him as chaperone. Mowbray replies, "Clara, my lady, is somewhat willful, and I believe you will have to take the task of unharboring her into your own hands. I believe your ladyship will have to take the task of unharboring her into your own hands." Now, to unharbor was a commonplace of the time. But what triggered the word unharbor in Scott's mind was, of course, ladyship. So you have ship leading on to harbor. But if you are ship and harbor, what about hands, all hands on deck? I believe your ladyship will have to take the task of unharboring her into your own hands. Now, that extremely elegant sentence, of course, distinguishes John Mowbray, the local squire, however much he may have been backsliding, from the jacked-up nouveau riche of the Well. It's a most elegant example of Scott distinguishing between one of his characters and another. From trivia, then, let me turn to something richer. Walter Allen, a good popular critic, and a nice critic, once wrote that generally Scott's characters come awake in their dialogue only in the vernacular. This is not merely wrong, it is, unfortunately, obtuse. In the passage from Pate and Pearl, which I wrote, Pate spoke in English, scarcely tinged with Scots, until we came to Whilk. I kept my senses together, Whilk has been thought wonderful. But thereafter, in the passage I didn't read, the Scots comes thick and fast. Things like Simony Craws, Old Wife's Field Preaching, and so forth. Pate, a bonnet laird, and like Scott, a student of law, began his tale in English. But as he warmed to it, old passions came back and he fell naturally into Scots. Now, this is deliberate on Scott's part, so let me prove it. Rob Roy, Scott wrote, spoke in the Scottish brogue with its corresponding dialect and imagery, which, although he possessed the power at times of laying them aside, recurred at every moment of emotion and gave pith to his sarcasm. So let us listen for a moment to Rob speaking to Frank. Of those that were summoned to take me and to keep me and to retake me again, there was a moiety, as cousin Nicol Jarvie calls it, that had nae will I should be either ta'en or keep it fast or retain. The English and Scots seesaws on the fulcrum of the French word moiety. Rob's mix of English and Scots reflects on his cultural dualism and on the dual loyalty of his pursuers. Pate in Peril, to begin with, hurled down the brae in English, but once free, he chased himself o'er the braes in Scots. Far from the conversation coming alive only in the vernacular, the English is essential to the Scots and vice versa, for Scott sets voices off against voices. English against Scots, English and Scots. like protons and neutrons in the atom. Had Stevenson done that, critics would have acclaimed his artistry. Stendhal wrote that Scott's passionate characters seem to be ashamed of themselves. Not so, but they look both ways. Wet sand at low tide records the opposing pool of moon and earth. The ripples of linguistic variety in Scott trace the tug-of-war of cultural forces of which the characters are the instruments and their speech the expression. This seems to me to have been greatly missed by many, many English critics in the last 50 years. I will move finally now to exploratory and European in the one group. By exploratory, I mean in depth. Pollen grains sink to the bottom of lakes, and cores of silt can now be used to recreate the landscapes and climates of prehistory. It is legitimate to breeze over the surface of Scott, but a core through a Scott novel will show the care which he gave to the craft of writing. Take St. Ronan's Well. It clangs with the strident discord of the chattering classes, each linguistically differentiated on a scale of snobbery. Snobbery was endemic to the age. The great Scottish 18th century publisher Andrew Miller once took the waters at Harrogate when that supreme snob, Jupiter Carlyle, was there. Here is Carlyle writing about Miller. When he appeared in the morning in his well-worn suit of clothes, they couldn't help but call him Peter Pamphlet, for the patron of Scotch authors, with his city wife, were sufficiently ridiculous when they came into good company. Beat that if you can. It shows, of course, that the characters in St. Ronan's Well were not caricatures, and Scott cut their vices perfectly. When the people at the well wanted Tyrrell up at Meg Dodd's, wanted them to join their company, they sent him 3 separate letters of invitation. Now, this might seem like comic overkill. In fact, it is a takeoff of the traditional classical rhetoric of the grand, the middle, and the plain styles. In Old Mortality, Kettle Drummle and the other preachers of the covenant use a hortatory, highfalutin rhetoric. The mantle of that in St. Ronan's Well falls on the Reverend Chatterley, who, says Scott, wrote classical flowers of rhetoric. Mr. Winterbottom, by contrast, wrote in the best style of diplomacy, while Sir Bingo's hand was coarse, irregular, and schoolboy. Scott has fun, but there is self-parody there also, for in alerting to the reader the fact that the novel is about artificial conventions, he includes in that his own conscious artifice as writer. A Roman once said that an artist reasons only when he is at a loss. When Scott gives his creativity full rein, reason out the window, the artist in control, his characters run the whole gamut of the 3 styles to their heart's content and ours. And in his descriptive narratives there is little problem, and Scott is especially distinguished in being what one calls a historical painter in words. But when he has to address his readers in his own voice, in the first person, directly in the first person, he can freeze. Take Red Gauntlet. The first volume of Red Gauntlet is an exchange of letters between Darcy and Ellen. Volume 2 begins with narrative, Scott writing in the first person, and I'll read you the opening sentence. The advantage of laying before the reader, in the words of the actors themselves, the adventures which we must otherwise have narrated in our own, has given great popularity to the publication of epistolary correspondence. Now, Scott said, I write grammar as I speak to make my meaning clear. But that is not Scott's voice. It has gone posh. In his desire for decorum, for correctness, he has moved up a style to epistolary correspondence. I'm not being funny about this, I'm not imagining it, because in The Antiquary, Scott has Edie Ochiltree take the mickey out of Jonathan Oldbuck by saying that Jonathan has got the epistolary correspondence. And yet, when he comes to write in his first person, in Red Gauntlet, he falls into the exact same trap as he gave to Jonathan Oldbuck through Edie. And this brings me to the European dimension. Because I have been at times somewhat uneasy about Scott's first-person narrative syntax, I fail to see that when he subjects his passionate creations to the test of reason, he appears quite clearly as a Scottish man of the 18th century, of the Scottish Enlightenment, who is scornful of superstition, upholds the laws of nature and science, and believes in progress. His romanticism is curbed, at any rate, by a pragmatic rationalism. Now, I didn't really see this until I started trying to read Scott in contemporary European translations, particularly in French and Italian. And there, this rational voice comes through with astonishing clarity, because the syntax which he uses in English, slightly uncomfortably English, is common to these European languages which share the same tradition as Scotland had of humanist rhetoric. I once showed a French translation, contemporary French translation about 1821 of Rob Roy to my next door neighbour George Bruce, and he said, I've never heard that voice before. But his continental readers did hear it, and I suspect they still do. For I'll close with reading something from the Milan newspaper, the Corriere della Sera, of 23rd December last. It gave its centre page, whole of its centre page, to a review of a new translation of Ivanhoe published by Garzanti. But what caught my eye was this. Question. Where did Karl Marx derive his theories of the class struggle? Answer, from Ivanhoe. Well, I sat back when I read the article. The article goes on. What, you may well ask, have the duels, jousts, intrigues, and loves of the England of Richard Lionheart to do with the struggle of proletariat and capitalist? If all you remember of Ivanhoe is a film which brought the two tailors, Richard and Elizabeth, together in glorious technicolor, the link might escape you. But if you go back to the book, to the supreme godfather of 19th century historical romance, you will discover a clear and defined picture of a society at war with itself. This book, published in 1820, had an immense influence on writers, intellectuals, and historians. Its sympathetic mixture of modern theories of society and the richest characteristics of the Middle Ages covered the thought of Marx, with Scott as his accomplice. Complice Walter Scott, finished. How very different from the home life of our dear Queen. I'm not suggesting you take all that on board. But Hazlitt said that Scott's effect on his first readers was like plunging a nervous valetudinarian into a cold bath. It looks as if that still happens in Italy today, where the supreme godfather still makes essentially front-page news. The more important then to see our new edition through to completion, so that when Scott has at last a reliable text and his genius has been reasserted, people in generations to come will understand why our greatest living English man of letters, Sir V.S. Pritchett, calls Scott the only Shakespearean talent in the English novel. I rest my case and ask you to rise and drink a toast to the memory of Sir Walter Scott.
Memory of Sir Walter Scott.